Welcome to today's episode of The Square. It's going to be a little bit different. So let's get through the normal stuff. I'm Brandon Carmichael. This is James Adams, architect on the commercial sector. But today's going to be a conversation about film and really about architecture and hopefully a better appreciation of architecture and the role of the architect through the lens of film. And it's been something that we have been kind of noodling with for a while. Certainly want to mention Adam Flaw, who's a producer for TheSquare, and Luke Boney, who's the DP and at times co-director, don't let that go to your head, Luke, of TheSquare, and certainly instrumental in helping guide where some of these episodes go. And to your point, like there's a lot of people that are behind the scenes that some people you never really have an appreciation for.
Oh, so many roles for both.
Which is actually not that dissimilar from a building.
No, not at all. Very
You
similar.
have a whole lot of stuff that goes into that. So anyway, we have watched a couple of films specifically in preparation for today. This is going to be probably a multi-series thing. We don't know how many episodes. We're going to kind of let it grow as it needs to.
Yeah.
But I brought two films. So my two films were Inception and Gattaca.
Great movies.
And you brought
The Royal Tenenbaums.
The Royal Tenenbaums.
And, you remember?
And North by
North by
Northwest.
Northwest.
So we kind of cover various periods of Hollywood history,
Yeah.
various actors, and certainly various stories. And the idea is just to have a conversation. We may get to one film. We may get through all four.
Yeah. You mentioned how we did some planning for this, but really we watched movies, right?
Yeah.
And nothing is better than being able to, at the home front, anywhere, able to say, I've got to work tonight. I got to go turn Inception on. So just hold on while I go.
You know what was interesting? When I went home, I told my wife, I was like, hey, I have to watch these movies. And she was like, okay, well, that's a good movie. That's a good movie. I had no idea. We've been married 15 years now. I have two children. I had no idea. She has a huge appreciation for old movies. She wanted to watch North by Northwest out of all four films on that list, and she liked them all. She wanted to watch North by Northwest because she really likes some of the older films. I had no idea.
It's one of the greatest movies of all time.
We're already healing marriages. Not that it needed to be healed.
Healing
you
marriages.
Got it.
I love it. I love it.
So I'd actually like to start with North by Northwest.
You
not
want to jump
just
right into the
because
movies.
I just want to go right to
Well,
it. Tell me why you.
I want to wait.
Tell me why you're here.
Okay, why am I? I'm here. Why am I here? Could we get a movie about that? No one would watch that. But I think, on that same point, I think that often when you, as an architect, when you look into architecture and film and blog posts, stories, things like that about it, to me, it always seems to be a bunch of old dudes talking about Blade Runner and why it's the greatest architecture movie, which it's not.
Yeah.
And that's another hot take we'll get to another day. Great movie. But we're not talking about that, right? We picked some films that I think
somewhere Francis Walker's rolling over. He's probably asleep at this point, but
he's rolling over. Yeah. But to that point, I think the movies that we picked and we talked, really the planning that went into this, and we'll see how much we get into those, was the bigger idea of architecture and the movies and how they relate. And I think one of the talking points we really covered was how complex it is to make a movie.
Yeah.
How many roles there are in it, how complex architecture is to produce a building, and how we gauge that type of art. They're both have functional roles in society, film and architecture does, but they're art. At the end of the day, they do have a role in art. Their aesthetics do matter, and that's hard to deliver a good aesthetic in either one of those mediums when so many people are involved in the process. And it's almost a miracle when a great building happens or a great story happens.
Yeah.
There are a lot of good ones. There are a lot of good buildings. There are a lot of good movies.
But it makes the great ones really stand out when they happen.
That's an important thing. And I think just getting into that topic is a big part of this too. I think understanding, a lot of professions are covered in film, right? Whether it be TV, General Hospital.
We experience a lot of things through film, if not only film first.
Yeah.
You were talking about tell the story about the MRI.
Oh, yeah.
Because I thought that was a great example.
I try to remember the backstory on this totally, but I saw an MRI recently. My daughter was actually getting one, and I had never seen the machine in person. It always was in movies. It was, and I think that one of these examples I gave were all across the map, but one of them was actually The Sopranos, a random TV series, early 2000s, and there's a scene when the lead character gets scanned, and I just had no idea what to experience, what it was like, and going into the hospital, Children's Hospital here in Dallas, and watching my daughter go into that machine, it was a very, very different experience. A very large room. It's very controlled environment due to the magnetic resonation of scanning, how that works. And so we had to check everything that went in the room. And ironically, we watched a movie
while she was in the
she was
MRI
being scanned. They had a sister. She watched Disney's Tangled, but a movie that we'd seen hundreds of times. I mean, we talked about how many movies we've watched or which movies we've watched over and over again. I failed to mention that the movies I have seen the most are going to be anything my daughter has wanted to watch.
I am always amazed at my son's ability to not like repetitively watch a movie over the course of days, repetitively watch a movie over the course of a day. They can watch the same movie 3 times in one day and be fascinated by it and be quoting it for months on end. I forget what I forget what movie it is that they've been watching recently. It was Matilda. Of all of the singing one.
Yeah.
And I hear them as they're going to bed singing Revolt, Revolt, Revolt.
Okay, something on a similar note is it's quite common to quote movies, right?
Yeah.
I'm quoting movies all the time.
Yeah.
And there are quotes I think I have absolutely right. I'm sure I'm butchering a lot of quotes.
Yeah.
But we all know them. And usually we can find a common understanding of what that quote is and the context of it. And I think architecture, again, very similar. It's easy to bite off pieces of architecture and think of iconic shapes of buildings or materials or plazas or whatever it might be. And I think that we all do that. Even those of us who aren't in the building and design industry, we still interact with buildings every day, right?
Yeah.
We're in a building right now. If you were watching this, you're probably in a building. And if you're not in a building, you are looking at a building and you can see one because unless you recorded this or in the mountains and watching it replayed on your phone, you have to be around architecture in a built environment. So it's a big part of what we're doing. So everyone knows buildings, but we don't always understand them. And back to that point about how we learn about so many things through film. That's how a lot of us outside of the industry know about architecture. We know about it through movies, both architects themselves, the profession of architecture. Think of the Brady Bunch, right? And, Architect or Mr. Ed or millions of examples. But we know the buildings themselves from film.
Okay, so then this may be a little cliche, but I'm curious about what was the first film you remember watching, and what was the first building you remember like appreciating the design?
That's a great question. You think I'd know that off the top of my head? I think for movies, the first one I actually recall, and it is May the 4th.
May the 4th be with you.
May the 4th be with you. But it's Return of the Jedi. I know I saw E.T. before that. And I have some memories of that. But I distinctly remember Return of the Jedi, and I remember some key scenes in that movie. The palace of the lead gangster in the first, or Jabba the Hutt. I remember that palace very well. A lot of the imperial architecture of the Death Star, and so you probably could do a whole episode on just Death Star architecture.
We may need to do a whole,
But that's probably one of the first ones I remember from that perspective. And then what was the second part of the question?
The building. What's the building that stands out in your mind?
First building. Gosh, that's a tough one. I grew up I grew up in Albuquerque before moving to Houston, and so there's a lot of historic architecture, if you will. There was a lot of the Pueblo structures that were there. Some of the earliest things I remember seeing in the built environment. Something more modern. It's actually probably the World Trade Center, the towers.
Yeah.
The old towers. And I didn't see them in person, but I remember them from reading about them and learning about them and seeing their architecture and how massive they were and how commanding and the emotional experience they evoked. Even if you weren't in front of them, even just from looking at a photograph, you could pick up on that. That's probably a really early experience.
I think I was talking to you about this a little bit earlier, but I think the movie that this is so typical. The movie that stands out for me as like one that I will just has this special place in my heart. It wasn't the first movie I saw, and it wasn't the first movie that made me think, or feel something, but Dumb and Dumber. Because I have such memories tied to it with my roommate in college. Because we had taken our big old CRT monitor and we kind of pointed it towards the bed. And that was one of those movies that we just kind of always had playing at certain times. And we would, at a certain point fall asleep, turn it off, wake up the next morning, be like, we're just going to watch 5 minutes. And then we would end up missing class because we were sitting there. Hopefully my parents aren't watching this. But they would sit there. We would sit there and watch the whole rest of the show. And it just, I can't even begin to count the number of times we watched that movie. And the funny part is I was fortunate enough to have a roommate who was from the same, I went to school in Chicago, and he was from the same town I was in Florida. So we knew each other. And we were kind of like on this adventure of college in Chicago, right along, Lloyd and Harry, and then not having an architecture background at all. The first building I can remember like having an emotional connection with was actually Parkland, and it was because I didn't have an appreciation for an architect or a designer's point of view really before working at Corgan, and very early on when I started working here, we got to go and tour it. And I thought it was such a cool design from the outside, but they took us to the NICU. And I had such an appreciation for the NICU because my son had been in the NICU right after he was born. And the way that they had designed it so that it was right next to the L&D rooms, and they were private, so you could be in the NICU with your son. And when my son had been in the NICU, you couldn't be in the NICU. You could go and visit him, but you couldn't stay with him. Yeah. And I remember thinking, gosh, somebody thought this through in a way that really is going to have a huge impact on the people's lives that inhabit this space. And I remember vividly it being something that kind of struck me as the importance of focusing on the people that inhabit a space.
Yeah, that's touching on another hallmark of architecture is that we talk about its complexity in film. Both of these evoke a range of emotions. Yeah. And architecture is often designed categorically to, like a film, to evoke certain emotions, right? Or a certain
for sure
comfort with the space, or to put awe into you. And I think, like film, you can watch a film several times and notice different things every time you watch the film. And how you experience a film at different moments or times in your life, or who you're with, can alter that experience, just like architecture. And I think the reason why, again, goes back to how complex they are, how many steps there are along the way in that process to tell that story, whether it's in a film or tell the story of a building and what you're doing and why you're there, even the process. We spend so much time in architecture, in the details, but even with the big ideas, we're trying to understand, these milestone parts of a procession in architecture, about the arrival sequence, that sense of arrival when you're there, the wayfinding in a space and how you get through there. A lot of these things you can solve with signage, right? But a good architecture is ideally aspiring to make it an easy process to understand where you're going in a building and why you're going there. Yeah. It should feel natural. And I think in film there are tools you can overcome. You can
do wayfinding for the story in
flashback, or you can tell instead of showing in film, which it's not always the best way to do it, but you can't, right?
Well, and again, to draw another parallel, there's the cleverness with which you do it, and the even subtlety with which you do it, how intuitive it is to be able to get from one piece of the building to another, or one piece of the story to another, where you didn't even realize that you ended up there, but it was very fluid, is I think probably a mark of a lot of great directors too.
Yeah.
All right, so we got to get through one film.
Yeah, we do.
So, are you good starting with North?
Let's do it. North by Northwest.
Yeah. Okay. This was my first watch through for this, and I'm a big Cary Grant fan. Yeah. I will tell you, when I started watching it, and I love a lot of Hitchcock films. I certainly haven't seen them all, but I have my favorites. When they've captured Cary Grant and they're in the
cab?
That was a great scene too. But when they're in the library, and you're kind of thrown off by the different angles because they skew the angles a lot, and then James Mason walks in, and all I could think was, that's Captain Nemo. Because I love 2,000 Leagues Under the Sea growing up. Oh, yeah. And he was in so many great films, but I had to kind of like, it threw me out for a second because of my personal, preference to watch him.
Well, those kind of things happen in architecture as well, right? There are certain structural solutions or methods There are architectural detailing that we use to evoke a certain emotion,
Yeah.
maybe like an actor, because architecture in film is a character, right?
Yeah,
In
absolutely.
a good film, it is, right? And
100%.
I think just to backtrack to, so North by Northwest,
Yep.
1959,
Yep.
Alfred Hitchcock. It was to be the Hitchcock of all Hitchcock movies,
Yeah.
right? I think it's somewhere probably early, but it's not his first work. It's what, fifth or sixth film?
Yeah,
something
somewhere
like
along
that.
in there.
Okay. So some people consider it the first James Bond film in a
Yeah.
sense. This whole whodunit kind of movie. Well, not whodunit, but case of mistaken identity,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And espionage. It's
Danger.
yeah. This is a movie, made in the late 50s.
Yeah.
And the architecture, the reason I picked this movie as being a great film is the role of architecture in this movie. We're talking about a man who he's a advertising guy,
Yep.
Mad Men type character, right,
Yep.
in the 50s, and starts off with just tons of people in the movie. It's New York City, it's packed, and he is clearly a man of taste and wealth.
He's in power.
He is.
He knows what he's doing.
He's got his
He's got
assistant
control.
with him, and
Absolutely.
taking notes for all the things he needs done.
Has a great relationship with his mother.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And we get all these shots of New York. We got all
Yeah.
these great shots of New York, of his office, and it leads him from that first point, starting off in his office, to the Plaza Hotel. And so we see all this wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, we're seeing this is post-war America. We're 15 years into it. Like America is just these are from a financial perspective probably some of the best times in America.
For sure.
Maybe besides the late 20s, right?
Yeah.
And that opulence is shown in the film. You're seeing all this wealth, and you see how he's part of that, right? And then quickly he becomes this character who is helpless
Yeah.
to get free, and he's a prisoner in plain sight, even with all the wealth and trappings of. I mean, they go to all these points to show all the clothing and the branding, all these things that are in the
Yep.
movie, and
The
make those
Bergdorfs.
connections. Yeah,
Yep,
Bergdorfs,
absolutely.
the purse and things like
Yeah.
that, and the architecture is in the same way. I think we talked about this a little bit beforehand, but an iconic part of that movie, the third act of that movie, is at this house, right?
Right.
And this house is
Which is not a Frank Lloyd Wright
not
house.
a Frank Lloyd Wright house, but it was designed to be a Frank Lloyd Wright house.
Right.
So the funny story about this, as I understand it, is 10 years earlier, he had been approached. Frank Lloyd Wright, architect, had been approached to do set design. For
Yeah, it wasn't a
movie.
Hitchcock film. It was
Wasn't
something
Hitchcock.
else.
But he basically asked for 10% of his fees would be.
They
on
thought
the
it was
project.
10% of the set budget initially, and they drew up a whole contract and sent it to him, and he goes, no. It's 10% of the budget, of the film budget.
Yeah, so
And that's why he never worked in a film.
didn't happen, right? So I can't name the set designers who worked on this, but they made this. There's a great matte painting of the house. There's probably looks like probably a pre-production still
Yeah.
of the film of the house. So it's here we go. Here it is in the movie. So the home it's got some pretty iconic Frank Lloyd Wright moves, which would have been appropriate, and they really understand that in the building. These supports underneath it aren't quite something you would see on a Frank Lloyd Wright house, but falling water had been done quite a while before this, and Frank Lloyd Wright is a household name. He's everywhere at this time period, right?
Yeah.
And so they really wanted that look of the home. Again, it shows this opulence and the wealth and the modernity of what is encapsulated by these characters. The evil henchman is in this house, and this is also a good lead into setting the tone for. We probably could do a whole episode on this, but villains in James Bond movies
Yeah.
and other movies that parrot that or copy it, parody it, start from. They come from this house. This idea of this very, very contemporary, modern, futuristic
for
house
sure.
that tells this story. And so this all happens at Mount Rushmore in this final act, and Cary Grant comes into the home to save the day, I guess, essentially. But this architecture just speaks to that time period. And we had also some shots in this movie.
Well, before you
Okay.
go off of this one,
Yeah,
and thank you to everybody that's behind the scenes. This is also an early VFX shot.
Yeah.
Because essentially, and I don't know exactly where the line is, but I'm going to guess it's somewhere in here with the road. This was all live action,
Yeah.
and that was all a matte painting, and they just combined it in the lab to create this exterior because I was reading about how they had to go through like all this whole permitting process, and all these environmentalists and park rangers had to go with the set designers just to be able to go and take location photos on the top of Mount Rushmore. It was a complete non-starter. They were going to be able to build anything.
Yeah.
And so they basically built this in Culver City, a couple of the interiors and a couple, not the whole building. But they did these matte paintings and several ones, and I think the UN building and a few others we'll look at in a minute.
Yeah.
Go after
well,
this.
no, actually, I love that because talking about the way this scene was made in the movie, because a little off tangent here, but one of my favorite filmmakers, I'm not saying his films are my favorite, but as a filmmaker is James Cameron.
Mm-hmm.
And I love his work and grew up on a lot of those action movies, Terminator 2,
Yeah.
The Abyss, Aliens, all these movies in the 80s. And, you know, before he made movies, and you probably know this a lot better than I do, but you know, he painted these kind of back plate paintings for movies. He did this, and he made models and other things like that. And I think that showed the complexity again, the many hats you can wear as an architect or maybe as a filmmaker to understand the bigger vision. And so understanding how he wanted a film to look, how James Cameron wanted a film to look when he paints some of these kind of scenes. You know, it was something that spilled over into his talent, into being able to visualize how he wanted to make a story, tell a story later on.
So funny enough, before James Mason became an actor, he was in architecture school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I found that little tidbit when I was researching for this, and I had no idea that he wanted to do that. So let's take a look at the UN stuff, because I think those are, again, beautiful matte paintings. So there's next year, and this is actually a live shot because the UN building had been just finished before they filmed this.
And just you speak to the international style of architecture here. This is modern architecture. This is really was what was driving that movement, and the power, the wealth of the UN, the world, where we were headed, the optimism that was in our culture at that time period of progress and of growth. It's so evident there. I love this.
Such an iconic shot.
This map painting is just fantastic. And it's only on screen for a few moments as he gets into the cab, which I guess just a small portion, and the cab at the top of the page is actually the one that's drives off in the scene. But it gives you the scale of this building. And I think it reinforces the architecture, this idea of this very powerful, strong building, this fortress that you come into. But it's a fortress not of stone, but of glass and steel, of modern materials. And this,
Hitchcock certainly wasn't alone in this, but again, it reinforces that idea of the environment and the architecture being a character in the film. Like this is another matte painting where basically everybody in the lower fourth is live, and then they matte painted the top. But it's that idea of we're seeing this is, I think these scenes are like in the first third of the movie, right before he really has to go on the run, and they're already kind of setting up that modern style for what's going to happen at the very end of the film.
Yeah, again, you're seeing a lot of that international style influence. You're seeing the modernism. You're seeing the cantilevers. You're seeing all these things that were of the time period of this new architecture coming through. We're coming out of this traditional architecture 50 years earlier, and modernism is reaching its peak. It's mid-century that we know of. It's happening when this movie was made. So it speaks to all those great ideas. It's pushing ahead, and I think that's something that this movie captures to frame these characters. This is supposed to be a character who, while the everyday person probably would never go to the UN, never go in here. I mean, they had trouble even getting here to film anything, right? They didn't even film the scene here because they couldn't get in. We're seeing this we're getting the emotional response from that for the average, film goer to see this movie. Even for things we'll never experience. Most of us will never experience. We're not going to be a madman on Madison Avenue making ads, but we watch TV and we know the commercials and what goes into all of that, right? We use the products. We're a consumer nation at that point. We're really kind of coming into that, and that includes consuming architecture, which is something that's out of reach for most people.
So
every day,
along that line,
even though we're in it, even though we're in architecture every day, we don't make it. Most of us do not.
So I think that's a great segue, because I think that one of the things that's interesting about films is when the set design is appropriately used, when the director has spent that time making it a character that works with the film, you don't even think about it. Like, you don't think about the set design. It just naturally goes with the story. Yeah. I've got to imagine there's a tie there to architecture, especially architecture that's really well done and is intuitive, you don't think about it. It's just something that makes a building naturally more, comforting, navigatable, whatever it is that the designer is going for. It's something that bad architecture stands out way more than good architecture does, especially from an interior and a usability standpoint.
Yeah, yeah. We should segue here because I think that wants me to bring me to my second movie.
Yes,
actually. I want to go to the Royal Tenenbaums. So next movie,
I'm a sucker for Wes Anderson.
Right, Wes Anderson. Wes Anderson's very in vogue and has been for a while. But I think it's his third film, maybe at least fourth, was The Royal Tenenbaums. So 2001,
Yep.
a movie that I saw I think 5 times in the theater in about 4 days because I just fell in love with it instantly. Instantly loved that movie. And while I was in architecture school,
Yeah.
a few years earlier, he had been making a movie called Rushmore.
Yep.
1998, and I think 98, could be 97. But anyway, in 97 or 98, when they were filming it, one of my classmates, Stephen Landon, who actually lives in Hawaii now, but he was in architecture school as well, and he was very into film. And so he had seen they were going to be filming a movie with Bill Murray in Houston.
Yep.
And so he tried to get a bunch of us to go down there to be extras in the movie. So he has a non-speaking role in Rushmore, which is his claim to fame. I wish I had gone down there in hindsight. He said it was great to talk to Bill Murray and go to the catering line as an extra and all that kind of stuff. But so then fast forward a couple of years and saw Royal Tenenbaums. Anyway, Royal Tenenbaums to me, it's my favorite movie.
Yeah.
Movie I've seen more than I've seen Star Wars, and I love Star Wars.
Wow,
Who doesn't love
that's
Star
saying
Wars, right?
something.
And the thing about that movie is it's something that is so warm a movie. It is the way it is filmed and how it is shot and the set design more than anything else. So the story in Royal Tenenbaums is about a bunch of geniuses who I guess you could call it the trappings of adolescence and peaking early, right? And it's like where are these individuals' lives going as they're now adults? And the set of that movie is a home in Harlem, a very large house. It's referred to as 111 Archer in the movie, and it's a real place. And they spent, I think I understand, you may know more about this too. They spent like 6 months. Wes Anderson did with his team
propping and staging,
getting this home ready. It's a very maximalist architecture in this movie. So I recently went to the last residence of the architect and professor at UT, Charles Moore. He has a home in Austin. I was there a few weeks ago. And every little tchotchke you could ever imagine is in that home. And while the man has been, while Charles Moore passed away a long time ago, you can feel his personality in that home still today, all this time later. It's been so well preserved. And the Royal Tenenbaums is like that. Every one of the rooms that these 4 children grew up in this house is so evident, their personalities. And it's a character, the house is unto itself, which became a hallmark of Wes Anderson, I think, kind of after this film. You see it in so many of his movies. And before this, while he started, there's a Frank Lloyd Wright house. The only Frank Lloyd Wright home in Dallas, one of 4 Frank Lloyd Wright projects in Texas, period, is one of the opening scenes in Bottle Rocket, his first movie, right? And so he obviously saw the importance of architecture in making film, but it wasn't until here where we began to see this amazing set.
Well, and even his composition, it's architecturally motivated. I think what's interesting about this, the set designers, and I should have looked up exactly who they were, but this had to be such a project of a lifetime, because it's not just going in and propping one house. It's propping really 6 houses, right? Because each floor has the room in the corner that is the personality of the 3 children, or I guess 2 children and 1 adopted child. Yes,
that's right. And one neighbor who never comes over for every meal, right? Oh, and Wilson's character. Yeah,
I love how there is zero doubt where the city, where the context for this house is.
New York, right?
Despite the fact Wes Anderson went out of his way to make sure that it didn't have any specific New York landmarks.
Yeah. It's also a movie that, which I think one of the reasons why he did that also was because of specifically the architecture. So you're saying he makes it so you don't know it's New York.
Right.
Well, he also has to conceal certain buildings and structures because those buildings and structures also date to a certain time. And so while the movie is
It gives it a timeless
it
aspect.
does
Absolutely.
timeless, but also it's this nagging feeling of like you feel like you're in the 70s,
Yeah.
but you're not because there's technology they're using that's a more current day. But there's certain technologies they don't have in the movie, and other things that they lean into that makes you like, okay, this is definitely when this movie's frozen in time.
Right.
In the 70s when they were little kids, but now we're seeing them as adults, and it's still the 70s in
Yeah.
New York.
I was reading an
Very
article. The writer said this, so I definitely don't get credit for saying it. But the writer said basically this was the story that a young Wes Anderson living in Texas. This is how he imagined the lives of New Yorkers were through reading the magazine, The New Yorker.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of led to his inspiration for this story. And when you think about that, all of the different kind of dramas and whatnot, while not being cliche, 100% fall in line with what you would imagine somebody reading The New Yorker would experience.
Yeah, it's a metaphor because it's also speaking to that time period when New York was in full decay.
Right.
Right, and there's all this grandeur and belief of what New York was. I'm going to flip back here, but Grand Central Station plays a role in North by Northwest,
yeah.
right? And so we're here in this New York where we don't get to see those monuments to success. We're just seeing this decaying city, but it's still a little bit more modern. Not quite sure. And a comment you made there reminds me when I was young, I used to watch a lot of film, and we had one of the only real treats we had as far as like luxuries was my parents had HBO as a kid. We didn't just for a while there, and this is the 80s and HBO, so it is just chock full of everything a young developing child should not be watching. So I watched, I remember, in what I remember when I think of that, I think of like movies like Death Wish, which is about an architect, right, who is on a vengeance path to take down the seedier parts of New York City.
Yeah.
Well, that's the New York City I grew up seeing. It was always alleys with fire escape ladders, people
or the sewer that you could go down in.
And it was that kind of thing, which that probably ties into something came a little bit later. Eastman and Laird, the cartoonists who did the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in the mid '80s, late '80s, that we all know today. But it was this very gritty New York in the sewers, right? But that was how I saw New York growing up. And then fast forward to the early '90s when we've got Seinfeld and Friends and things that are showing me this New York that is the new New York.
Yeah.
The 90s New York that is suddenly
the hip New York
place to be.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of ties into, I think, the Royal Tenenbaums in that sense.
Speaking of that scene to Grand Central Station, the producer brain of mine went back to, God, he got so many extras in that shot to fill out Grand Central Station for essentially like a 5 to 6 second shot where he goes up to the ticket line and then gets out of the ticket line and goes around the corner Anyway.
What's interesting about that, too, so
now it's all VFX.
Well, while we're on the mindset of talking about how time is seen through film in these movies, it's an interesting topic. I don't think we hadn't talked about this at all before, at least not directly, is a movie that you had brought, which I'm jumping ahead here, is actually Gattaca. So you're at Gattaca. So this is a movie that I've only seen a couple of times. I watched it again recently. It's actually a brilliant film. It's a dystopian science fiction piece. It's filmed entirely in Northern California.
Right.
And in the valley and whatnot, and it has a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright architecture. It's got a pre-doc building that's now been demolished actually at Cal Poly. It's the administration building on the left here. Yeah, I think it's called the CIT building that was demolished due to seismic issues some years back. But that's pre-doc architect from New Mexico, actually my home state. So. This movie, why I bring this up was this is a dystopian future, right?
Yeah.
And the contrast, the comment you made about Grand Central Station, when you watch that movie, it is packed with people.
Yeah.
People everywhere. It's New York City in the 1950s, late 50s, and it is robust, energetic. Again, already talk about decaying New York later in the 70s. Here we are at the peak of New York, right, in North by Northwest. Well, this movie being this dystopian future, I don't know if we actually have a year associated.
Sparse.
The only place there's people that we really see is when they're going to work. When they're all going to that's shot in a Frank Lloyd Wright building north. I'm going to get it wrong, but it's north of San Francisco, I'm trying to think of the campus it's on, but it's a beautiful building. One of the last building. It's actually the last commission I think he did in 59. So filmed it made at the time that North by Northwest was filmed, but now it's this future sterile. There's a lot of concrete. There's early brutalist architecture throughout this film. Everything is clean and sterile, which is a point of the movie. It's about genetics and
you know what's interesting about that is you see to that idea of clean and sterile, and there's this idea that there's, it's such a, they're trying, the story is, the context is, it's such a better, future because you can program, your sons and daughters and humans, and you have these rows of desks, right? And it's so utilitarian, and yet there's such a sparsity of people. You're absolutely right. Even when they're going to work, and a lot of films that I'm thinking like, Elysium and other ones where you've got, there's sparsity and there's space where the upper crust is, right? Where there's the high society, and lower society always has, overcrowding and poverty. There's none of that in here. And it's just it's a uniformly kind of bleak outlook. Yeah. And you have all these really, these systems, even coming down to how you would program out a child you want to have, and obviously if you that's a big part of the story, and yet you have these beautiful pieces of architecture and almost product design that happen in Jude Law's character's house. Yeah. Oh yeah. And there's this weird dichotomy between brutalism and utility, and yet a beauty and an art in very small patches. Yeah, yeah. Like the stairwell.
The eugenics. I mean, this is supposed to be the metaphor, right, for the for DNA. The staircase, exactly, right? Yeah. Who's living down here and who's there? The duality of this movie is these two characters, Ethan Hawke and Jude Law, here as being the Jude Law's. But the kind of premise behind the movie, right? Eugenics is about the ability to manipulate DNA in the future so that you can make your child more perfect, or whatever that version.
It can't protect you from an accident.
It can't protect you from an accident. Also, and nor, as to the character of Ethan Hawke, means that it should be a limitation, that lack of perfect. He was a natural, I forget, there's a term they call it, normie. I think there's something to that effect they use. But also an interesting thing here is this movie is, it's predominantly this future work environment that is sterile. This is that Frank Lloyd Wright building. And it's a bunch of, I'll go there, a bunch of white males that are unhappy but have all the wealth and everything. And they're all fighting to be the next best guy. And that shot earlier of the office space, Ethan Hawke is talking to the administrator, I guess, in the facility. And that environment, again, we're in a Frank Lloyd Wright space, and a building of his that was, again, an iconic one. I think it's the Johnson Wax. Shows the office of the future and these big open offices, and it's brightly lit, and it's this happy place. This is the future. It's an open office. It's great. Yeah. But then you see this exact same kind of setup, and now it's just bleak, dark. The light's coming in dimly through the windows outside. There's very little artificial light in the space, and everyone's just working away. And look how everyone almost looks the same.
And I think it's really interesting at the end of the story. Like, here he is. The whole movie leads up to him basically trying to beat the system, right? He's trying to beat the system. And ultimately, he fails. Yeah. He doesn't beat the system. They have the random, drug test at the end, and it's another human. It's the doctor that ends up allowing him to be successful. Yeah. Yeah. And so he even though he can't beat the system, even though there's a suppression that really kind of in theory wins out, it's that humanity that comes in and saves the story at the end. Yeah.
It's just interesting how they film in these spaces, because I'm actually hoping to go see this building this summer. I'm going to be out there.
This is in L.A.?
This is north of Oakland and San Francisco, across the bay on the north side. I guess further north than.
You know what it's used for now?
Yeah, it's a university building. I believe. I'm going to get busted for that later, but you couldn't remember the director, so we'll call it.
There we go.
But this is a very the roof on this is like a bright. Yeah, there it is. That bright roof. Oh wow. It's a very. This is high Frank Lloyd Wright. Yeah. Late in his career, and it's got all the trappings of a Frank Lloyd Wright building. It's so ornamental on the outside, and on the inside has those grand spaces. So you don't see the outside in the movie, right? You wouldn't see this. It would be too revealing of a different, happier future, and instead we get these iconic shots inside, and the use of color in that movie is also important.
Oh, we could do a whole episode on.
We could, and I don't want to go too far into that, but the fact that like yellow and blue are a big part of the movie, this clean, blank architecture, and also some of the shots like of the pre-doc building, they're blank canvases. So then when you run a filter in film over that to give it this bright color, that color really pops. Then you really get the yellow or the blue in those scenes. It's red, yellow, and blue, I guess. They really pop because you have these. Here you go. You're going to see that right there. The dingy filter they put on that is very effective because it reflects on all those buildings, all that pavement, all that concrete.
Yeah.
Very effective tool in this movie, and this architecture too just evokes that sense of magnitude and mass that's with these buildings, right? So it's interesting how that
there's just such a weight to it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Very, very different than watching the Royal Tenenbaums, which this is minimalist architecture largely. You get very maximalist architecture and all those busy interior designed sets. I mean, the interior design in that Royal Tenenbaums is just, it's got everything, right?
Yeah.
And there's so nothing here. Very, 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 very little here. Both beautiful in their own way. They both evoke different emotions and different responses from people.
Well, and that kind of, we could just put the cherry on top with Inception, because you go from something where there's almost, it almost prides itself on a lack of things, to Inception, where your mind creates the whole world around it, and you have, there's a very literal kind of correlation to the architect, which actually played by various people throughout the film. But the idea being that they create these worlds that are immersive. One of the things that I first caught on to was how it really is, it mimics the creative process, because you have this idea where I think the character name is Ariande, is the one who creates these worlds. One of my favorite scenes in the whole movie is right after the cafe explodes, because Leo's character has explained you're inside this world and you're the one controlling it. And then she has this realization that she can create. Here's a great film, still from the film. She can create these worlds, and anything is malleable, even physics. And I've got to believe that this is like an architect's dream, right? Because she's able to see these where there's this they go on a walk and there's these mirror doors that they swing, and somehow they VFX'd out or hid the crew, and it's just this idea of both creation and perception, and how those two go together to quite literally create this story in someone's mind that then you bring the victim or the client, depending on which it is, into.
Well, it's that, as you said it, I mean, they've been time here, and an architect is dealing with so many factors. So in the movie, when you take out the laws of physics as one of the limiting factors, it's interesting. I know we bounced around on a bunch of different movies, but one other point I wanted to make was, I'm sure you're aware of this too, but back in North by Northwest, and you see this in a lot of film, but a movie like that where you have a very modernist home with large pieces of glass, right? We talked about how, the UN, all this glass, steel. You think of like the Farnsworth House and all the glass on it, the glass house, things like that, Philip Johnson. So they left the glass out of the house so you wouldn't get the reflection and glare, right? I guess there probably are a few scenes.
There's a couple of spots.
Where there is glass, but mostly it's all taken out. And it's just funny how that, is reflecting the architecture, reflecting people. It's just glass is such a key part of architecture as well. Total non sequitur there, but I just wanted to hit on it.
Well, and Christopher Nolan, has these incredible visions of how he wants a story to play out. And the same has to be true with an architect. And like you said, it's a love-hate relationship through the process. But you have this idea of what you want a building to do or what you want it to look like at the end, and then you spend however long, it could be a matter of months to a matter of years, having that come to fruition. Are there ties to how you creatively think through a design?
I think so. That it's a process, right? And kind of, I'm actually segueing from your question a little bit here, but that process is over time, right? And things change.
Which is a whole nother element in the movie.
Well, Christopher Nolan's probably signature thematic part of his stories is always time. All of his stories are about time, right? Go back to Memento or the most recent Tenet. Things like that. They're all about time. Interstellar, they're all about time. And this movie's about time as well.
Yeah.
It's about timing in this dream sequence. And what's interesting is that as you go through the process, things change, and you have to respond to those changes. And in design, goes to go through many iterations, because the first good idea they teach you in school in architecture, and I'm sure they teach this in a lot of design professions, is don't fall in love with your first idea, right?
Yeah.
Because your first idea, you might ultimately come back to that idea and manipulate it, but it's only a stepping stone in the design process for anything. And for architects, that's so critical. It's very easy to say, here's a solution. And
oftentimes when we're doing a discovery process, we'll do what we call the cup exercise.
Okay.
And it's where we have a cup, and it's got a little bit of definition to it, but then you have 2 minutes or 5 minutes to write down everything you could use that cup for.
Yeah.
And you get through the first 7 or 8 things that are just the obvious ones to some of the way more creative ones. I'll never forget it's kind of a metal cup, and they were like, oh, a squirrel could use it as a helmet for a nut war. And like, there's these things that you get to that you never would have thought, were part of it. And to your point, you have to get through those first ideas and not fall in love with them to get some of the meatier things.
Yeah, and then the idea that you loved in the beginning, that you were like, no, but it's the best idea. Okay, I'll put it aside, but I know I'm going to come back to it. Ultimately, you look at that idea later, if you've done this process properly, and you almost feel embarrassed about the first idea. You're like, wow, that's a terrible idea. Wow, I didn't suggest that. But it led to this process. And often in a collaborative environment, like in filmmaking or in architecture, most definitely, like in our studio, someone has an idea. Someone else has an idea, and that idea keeps building on that idea, and people offer other ideas and ways to solve that. And that happens as a response to technical aspects of the design, about what's feasible to build, what's more affordable to build, just what's a better plan. There are all these things that factor into that, that end up leading to ultimately, a great project at Corgan, right?
Yeah.
And film was the same way. But you think about how that correlates to this movie, Inception. So Inception's really about, Leonardo DiCaprio is a thief of ideas, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So he's putting together
a hijacker of ideas.
It's a heist movie, kind of, and he's putting together his team for the heist. And so Elliot Page in that movie character is the architect, brought on, and is being tested in the scene you referenced earlier, right? And that is someone who has to create this environment, that has to work in a dream sequence to convince somebody who they are in their the inception in their dream, right? So it has to be believable, has to evoke certain emotions, and it has to essentially capture them in that idea and in that dream sequence, right? That's how I remember how that works. It has been a while since I watched that film. But that means that they had to be able to, as an architect, respond to all of those things and create this environment. But not only that.
Well, and guess what's in a client's mind too?
Well, and there's no laws of physics in this dream sequence, so they can bend reality like we see here. And I think it's a testament to this movie is how many knockoffs came after this, or just took the ideas from this and wanted to take advantage of that. You
made me think of something. Very opening scene they have, and I forget the actor's name. He's been in a couple of movies, but that he did the architecture, and the way that they're kind of busted is the primary character gets kind of thrown to the floor, and he's supposed to be in this private loft that he has, and he realizes that the carpet is like a polyester and not a wool. And so he realizes he's in a dream, and he points this out to them and goes, well, I know this isn't real because that carpet is polyester, not wool. And there's these elements that I kept thinking of, like, how many times have you, it's this amazing feat where they've wrapped him in a dream world, and the one little detail is what exposes the whole thing, or they just kind of drill on. And we've certainly been, not even in films, but in just projects we've done where the client will get attached to this one tiny insignificant detail. And I can imagine it's even exponentially happened with architecture too.
Oh, yeah. Well, think about the process in making film. One of the ones I think that a lot of people are aware of is storyboarding. Right? And we storyboard in architecture too.
Yeah.
It's not quite this linear process, maybe, but meaning a clip for a clip, right? But we do sketches, and we do all these. We're doing the same kind of stuff.
You're doing room by room,
and you're figuring out how that building goes together. And it's interesting if you show too much information too early, or you try to resolve something too quickly, the world pushes back, right?
Yeah.
You can't, meaning that you might evoke an emotion from a client or from someone from your design team or anyone that focuses on the wrong details. So you're really what that gets back to is storytelling. As an architect, we are also informing a client and guiding them to we're solving problems and we're guiding them to the solution to their problem as we see fit. And we have to guide them in a path that they can understand and that resonates with them. If we just jump to the solution early and show them a photorealistic rendering in the first meeting, they're going to get hung up on all kinds of details that aren't resolved yet, that we don't want them to be hung up on. So we have to tell the right story at the right time.
Do you have them? Do you find it difficult at times to have them to make a poor parallel, to acknowledge your role as the director almost and them as the audience? And what I mean by that is I can imagine as an architect, a lot of times they see you as somebody that's a necessity to go put plans together to build a building and less of a collaborator to design an incredible experience.
You know, I think it really depends because Chuck, this isn't, well, I heard this quote directly from Chuck Armstrong, and it's very much a truth in architecture, which is you're only as good as your clients. Your work, you can't do great architecture without great clients. I think that's actually what Chuck had said to me in a conversation one time. We were talking about a project, and our best work is with our clients who even if they don't know what they want, they can make decisions. They have enough vision to see that, and so we're often working they bring us on board to help them to that path, right? But those great clients, they know what they want when we're able to show it to them, and so it's a collaborative process. Sometimes they already know what they want already, but it's working together. So the director, we talked about this one time before, when you try to compare the roles in filmmaking to architecture, like if you have three main players or entities in architecture, which might be the architect, the contractor, and the who's paying the bills, the owner, right? And in film, you maybe have the producer, the developer. The producer, the director, and
the executive producers pay
the suits, right? But they're not always analogous with each other directly, because a really long way to answer your question or your comment and address it is the director might be the architect, but it might also be the owner. And likely it's both in a co-directed role ultimately, because ultimately the director is the client is the one who is having to make the final decisions. Ultimately, in most examples here, and so we as an architect only play a role in consulting to them to guide them on that path. And there are many things that they are taking into account that we need to be aware of, but often are even beyond our ability to, limitations of what we're privy to in the process. But we have to understand, we know what their budget is and what their program and their goals are, and often we lead them in a process on that to figure out what their program actually needs to be or what their budget might be. So you're wearing different hats at different time at the same time. So it's interesting. So it's very collaborative.
Well, I am excited about this series. I think it's going to be really a lot of fun. We definitely I think you've probably said, and I've definitely thought, wow, we need to do another one on that. We need to do another one on that. So if you're watching this and you're like, oh, I really wish they would talk about, X, Y, or Z, please feel free to put it in the comments or ping us and let us know. We'll have to talk about what our next one is. But I really look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching.